On October 6th, 1973, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against the State of Israel. The intelligence to warn them of this impending attack was not missing. It had been dismissed. For 6 months, Israeli military intelligence had been receiving indicators of a military buildup, troop movements, equipment positioning, intelligence from some of the best human sources in the world, including, as classified records later revealed, a warning directly from King Hussein of Jordan. None of it changed the conclusion. This wasn't a failure of collection, it was a failure of design. And that distinction is what this show is about. Welcome to the 10th Man Podcast. I'm Chris Porden. This show is about what happens when everyone agrees and what it can cost. Each episode takes one domain, one moment where consensus failed catastrophically, and asks, what did it take to build dissent into that system afterward? We start with where the name itself comes from. To understand what happened in October 1973, you have to understand what Israeli military intelligence believed in the months before that. There was a doctrine. Analysts called it the concept. It went like this. Egypt would only go to war if it had the air power to neutralize the Israeli Air Force. Without air superiority, Egypt couldn't win. And since Egypt hadn't acquired the aircraft needed for that, they received Soviet MiGs, but not enough and not the right kind, war was effectively off the table. It was a logical framework built on real evidence, and it was catastrophically wrong. What the concept missed, and what the Agranat Commission would later document in exhaustive detail, was that Egypt's President Sadat had redefined what victory meant. Sadat wasn't trying to destroy Israel. He was trying to change the political equation in the Middle East. If Egyptian forces could cross the Suez Canal and hold ground for even a few days, the superpowers would intervene. A negotiated settlement would follow. Egypt would recover the Sinai. That was the objective. Egypt didn't need to win the war at all. They needed to change the conversation. And that was a goal that didn't require air superiority. So the concept was built around the wrong question. But by 1973, that question had stopped being asked. Once the concept was accepted, evidence stopped competing with it. Contradictory information wasn't weighed against the framework. It was just processed through it. And whatever came out the other side just confirmed what everyone already believed. Here's what makes the Yom Kippur failure so instructive. It wasn't a case of missing information. It was a case of information being filtered through an unquestioned assumption. The indicators were there, documented in the Agranat Commission's findings. On October 1st, 1973, 5 days before the attack, Lieutenant Benjamin Simon-Tov, an Order of Battle intelligence officer in the Southern Command, delivered documents to his superior showing evidence of Egyptian war preparations, and he did it again on October 3rd. Both times, the information was received, filed, and the assessment didn't change. The IDF's chief intelligence analyst later testified to the Agranat Commission that in the week before the attack, he had asked the commander of military intelligence repeatedly, multiple times a day, to activate sophisticated listening equipment pointed at Egypt. He was refused, every time. The listening equipment existed, it was implanted, it was calibrated, it was ready, and it was never turned on, because the people in authority didn't believe there was anything to listen for. Then there was the source known in Israeli intelligence circles simply as the, quote, best source. This was Ashraf Marwan, Egyptian President Nasser's son-in-law, who had been providing intelligence to the Mossad. On the eve of the attack, Marwan called his Mossad handler with a warning that the attack was coming the next day. Mossad passed the warning up the chain, and it was not acted on in time. This is the pattern that makes consensus failure so dangerous. It doesn't suppress information. It just interprets it away. Every warning gets processed through the existing framework, and it emerges as confirmation that that framework is correct. So the analyst who sees something alarming isn't silenced. They're overruled by the accumulated weight of everything everyone else already believes. At approximately 2 p.m. on October 6, 1973, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal. Simultaneously, Syria attacked in the Golan Heights. Israel's frontline forces were overwhelmed. On the southern front, Egypt deployed more than 1,000 artillery pieces in the opening barrage. Israeli positions along the Bar Lev line, that fortified defensive line along the Suez, they were overrun in hours. 800 Egyptian tanks crossed in the initial assault. Israel mobilized its reserves and pushed back hard. The war ended 19 days later, with Israel in a tactically stronger position than it had started. But the cost was devastating. Over 2,600 Israeli soldiers were killed. This near disaster triggered a national reckoning. Prime Minister Golda Meir resigned. Chief of Staff David Elazar was dismissed. The Director of Military Intelligence, Major General Eliyahu Zeira, the man most responsible for defending the concept against all evidence to the contrary, was fired. The Israeli government established a formal commission of inquiry, the Agranat Commission. Chaired by Supreme Court President Shimon Agranat, it sat for 140 sessions. It heard testimony from 58 witnesses, and its report, published in April 1974, documented the failure in clinical and unsparing detail. And then it asked the question that every institution asks after a catastrophic consensus failure. How do we make sure this never happens again? The Agranat Commission's answer was structural, not cultural, structural. You can't fix groupthink by telling people to think differently. You can't eliminate confirmation bias through a memo. What you can do is build a system that requires dissent to exist, that makes the opposing view not just permitted, but mandatory. The commission recommended creating a dedicated unit within Israeli military intelligence, whose sole purpose was to challenge the conclusions of the research department, to look at the same sets of intelligence and ask, what if the mainstream analysis is wrong? What does the world look like if we assume the opposite? So this unit was established. Its Hebrew name translates roughly as the Comptroller Department. Its operational name was Ipcha Mistabra, which is an Aramaic phrase meaning on the contrary, or roughly the opposite appears to be true. So it was led by a colonel who reported directly to the head of military intelligence, not to the research department, whose conclusions he was tasked with challenging. That reporting structure was deliberate, because you can't institutionalize dissent and then make the dissenter report to the consensus. This is the real-world origin of what we now call the 10th man doctrine. A small unit, maybe a colonel, but a mandate to disagree. Here I want to be direct with you about something, because this show is committed to getting the history right. This phrase, 10th man, the specific formulation that if 9 people agree, the 10th must disagree, did not come from a classified Israeli military doctrine. It came from a novel. Max Brooks, the son of legendary filmmaker Mel Brooks, published World War Z in 2006. It's a fictional oral history of a zombie world war, told in the style of survivor testimonies. One of the book's recurring elements is an Israeli policy of mandatory dissent, a rule that forces one analyst to assume the opposite of whatever the consensus holds. Brooks called it the 10th man doctrine. In the 2013 film adaptation, that rule is stated explicitly on screen. The novel and film sparked genuine curiosity. People asked if it was real. And the answer is, sort of. The underlying thing Brooks was describing is real. The devil's advocate unit, the Ipcha Mistabra, the structural mandate to challenge intelligence consensus, that's documented history. Brooks appears to have been inspired by the real institutional response to the Yom Kippur's failure and give it a cleaner, more memorable formulation. What's fictional is that specific 10th man framing. There is no documented Israeli military protocol called the 10th man rule, at least as far as I know. There is, however, a real unit with a real mandate to disagree. Brooks dramatized it, that dramatization spread, and now the dramatization is often reported as the historical fact. I'm telling you this not to deflate the concept. The concept is real and important, regardless of what it's called. But I'm telling you because the actual history is even more interesting than the legend. A small unit of analysts whose job is to assume the mainstream analysis is wrong, reporting directly to the top of the intelligence or political hierarchy specifically so that they can't be overruled by the people whose conclusions they're challenging. That's a more sophisticated institutional design than the 10th person must disagree. But the real lesson isn't about counting heads. It's about what you have to do to a system to make dissent structurally impossible to ignore. So what actually made dissent impossible in October 1973? The Agranat Commission identified several factors, and they're worth naming specifically because they don't just belong to the events of 1973. They belong to any system, in any domain, where the stakes are high and the consensus has been in place long enough to stop feeling like a choice at all. Once the concept became the lens, it also became the filter. The concept said Egypt wouldn't attack. So evidence of Egyptian preparation was interpreted as a bluff or a fluke, a training exercise, a diplomatic signal. The framework didn't just survive contradiction, it started to consume it. Every piece of contrary evidence went in and just came back out as confirmation. The analysts who had doubts were probably junior to the analysts who didn't. The system that generated the concept was the same system whose job it was to question it. There was no independent review. There was no one whose formal responsibility was to assume the mainstream analysis was wrong. The dissenter and the consensus reported to the same authority. Israeli leadership was 3 weeks from an election in October 1973. Full mobilization of reserves, the appropriate response to a genuine war threat, was enormously expensive and politically disruptive. There was an asymmetry in the cost of different kinds of errors. Being wrong about the threat was catastrophic, but raising a false alarm was also costly. That asymmetry shaped every incentive in the system. Waiting felt cautious, but it wasn't. Israel had won decisively in 1967. The Six-Day War had demonstrated Israeli military superiority in a way that felt definitive. Confidence, earned confidence, justified confidence, had hardened into certainty. The same military that performed brilliantly in 1967 had stopped imagining a scenario where it would be caught off guard. Change those uniforms, change the decade, change the industry. The structure stays the same. A framework that can't be challenged from inside itself. A hierarchy that owns both the question and the answer. Incentives that make the cautious-sounding choice actually into the dangerous one. And prior success that makes the next failure harder to see coming. That's not a military pathology. That's the anatomy of how institutions across the board fail. There's a postscript to this story that I think is perhaps the most important part. In 2023, 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel on October 7th. At least 1,200 people were killed. According to reporting cited in a 2024 analysis published by the West Point Combating Terrorism Center, the IDF's Devil's Advocate unit, the Ipcha Mistabra, issued 4 warnings in the 3 weeks before the attack. The unit's head identified what he described as deep processes fundamentally changing the strategic situation. 2 written assessments were reportedly distributed to senior military and political decision-makers. The attack happened anyway. Now, I want to be careful here because the full picture is still largely classified. An official Israeli commission of inquiry has not yet been established. Some details remain contested. So we should be honest about what we do and do not know yet. But here's what researchers who study these systems have observed, and this point appears in the West Point analysis directly. The Devil's Advocate unit had a known structural problem long before October 7th, because its job is to assume the worst-case scenario that usually does not materialize. That unit is wrong most of the time. And when an institution is wrong most of the time, its role becomes routinized, ritualized, easy to ignore. The dissenting voice becomes background noise, present in the process, but without the weight to change the outcome. So the mechanism existed, but mechanisms will deteriorate over time, all the more if they're so frequently discounted. The unit built to prevent another Yom Kippur attack, the direct institutional response to the most catastrophic intelligence failure in Israeli history, apparently issued its warnings. And apparently, it still wasn't enough. This is the hardest lesson of this story. Institutionalizing dissent is not a checkbox. A dissent unit that can be routinely overruled is not a safeguard. It's just a record. It documents that someone objected. It doesn't guarantee that anyone listens. After October 7th, proposals were put forward in the Israeli Knesset to give the Devil's Advocate unit direct reporting access to the Prime Minister, the ability to demand intelligence from any agency in the country, and a legal obligation to provide input on any security cabinet decision. The proposals would make discussion of the dissenting view mandatory at the highest levels of government. 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, they're still working on getting the design right. The Yom Kippur War taught Israel that consensus is a structural liability in high-stakes intelligence analysis. The Agronaut Commission turned that lesson into an institutional design, and Max Brooks turned that institution design into a story that spread around the world under a different name. The 10th Man doctrine, as most people know it, is a fiction that points to a fact. And the fact is this: when the stakes are high enough and the downside of being wrong is potentially irreversible damage, you cannot rely on the same system that produced the consensus to challenge it. You need a separate structure and a separate mandate, and enough authority that dissenting view cannot simply be ignored. That's not a military insight. It's a human one. In our next episode, January 28, 1986, NASA engineers voted against launching the Space Shuttle Challenger, and they were overruled. The dissent existed, but it still wasn't enough. We'll look at what makes structured dissent fail, even when it's clearly present. Thanks for listening to The 10th Man.